In this video, we're going to be looking at composition. And the reason why this is the first video in the course is because we can have the best camera in the world, we can know how to use that camera perfectly, and we can be Photoshop experts, but if we have a poorly shot image, there's nothing we can do about it. It's never going to be a good photo. So with these techniques, hopefully you'll be able to apply them out into the field and come out with some really gorgeous images. Now, you'll notice that I use the same image when I demonstrate different techniques and different tips. That's because I like to combine ideas into one frame, and that way we can come out with the most impactful photo. So you'll see the same images over and over again in this demonstration. Now, there are two techniques I haven't included in here because I feel like they're kind of obvious, but I should mention that clearly we have to be shooting an interesting subject. That's got to be one of the most important things. If what we're looking at isn't important, then chances are, or it isn't impressive in some way, or it doesn't have some deep meaning as we look at it, then chances are it isn't going to be a very nice photo. It isn't going to be very impactful. It isn't going to have too much mood. So we need an interesting subject or a couple of interesting subjects. The next thing is to fill the frame. Now, every single image you're about to see here, I filled the frame with interesting stuff or parts of the image that complement the scene. I think there's only one image where you'll see some dead space, and that's an image from Dubai with the light trails at the bottom. Then we have a lot of sky, and there's nothing really we can do about that because the Burj Khalifa is so tall, it leaves a lot of empty space around it. But for the rest of the images, you'll see that I fill the frame as much as possible with interesting subjects, beneficial light, and anything that complements the mood of the scene in any way. So let's look at these 23 tips that will help you compose better images. And we'll start with light and shadow. In photography, people always talk about light and how we can understand and use light in our imagery. Here we have a naturally beautiful scene with the kind of a low-lying sun at sunrise. And essentially, the light is getting in from the sun, through the mountains, and it's lighting up certain parts of the clouds and the mountain to the right. But it's the shadows that are really what are creating the mood here. And the shadows, as you can see, are long and dark, and that's helping to add dimensionality to this particular scene. Now, if the sun was to the right and it was just bathing the entirety of the clouds in white, we wouldn't have those long shadows and it wouldn't be as impactful. And to top it off, because the sun is behind these mountains, we've essentially created a soft silhouette with the mountains. There's very few details, they're beautifully dark, and that in itself creates a beautiful mood, and it contrasts extremely well with the mountain on the right-hand side, which is nice and bright. So we're looking here to create nice, long shadows. Here we have a scene with no light, it's extremely overcast, and because there's no light, it's just flat. It doesn't have any impact on us whatsoever, even though it has the potential to be a beautiful scene. Now, looking at this image, this would also be extremely flat if we shot it in midday and the sun was coming right down. But because it was early in the morning, we are able to stretch out these shadows. And that gives the buildings more depth, makes them almost three-dimensional. You can almost reach out and grab them. To show you another example of this, we have an image from Scotland, which you'll learn how to create later on in the tutorial. And here again, we have some beautiful shadows from the rocks, and the sun's obviously behind the rocks, and it's just dragging out those shadows, creating more depth and more mood. And we have a nice shadow to the right here at the bottom right, which is helping to create a nice vignette. Now let's look at this scene without any shadows and without any sun coming through. Here there's no depth, there's no shadows, there's no real mood, there's nothing happening at all. There's no part of this image which is grabbing the viewer's eyes and saying, look at me. Whereas previously, with the longer shadows, that's exactly what it was doing. So shooting in beneficial light where we can stretch out some long shadows is always going to be a good way to develop extra mood. But we can look at light in a slightly different way as well. For example, we can bathe objects in light. So looking at the same scene, we can see where the sun is touching these objects, touching the rocks. And not only is this bringing out extra textures in the rocks so you can feel like you can touch them, it's also giving the rocks life and depth. And as soon as we look at that image, as opposed to the one which had no sun in it, we know exactly where to look. These rocks are standing out from the rest of the scene, and so are those areas in the foreground which are nicely lit up too. So having the sun touch certain objects, it creates a certain 3D element where shadows are exaggerated, but also the brighter sides of those objects are also exaggerated and our eyes are pulled towards them. Let me show you some more examples of this. Here we have the Horseshoe Bend in Arizona, and the sun isn't touching anywhere in the canyon itself, even though we have a very dramatic scene and a strong source of light. However, I was desperate to get a part of the foreground where the sun was touching it, because that immediately gives our scene more depth. And those rocks down there, again, we can almost feel the textures of that warm light. And here we're looking at the sun coming from the left, and it's bathing the entirety of the left-hand side of this hill. And it's lighting up the grass in the foreground beautifully. And by contrast, we have the right side of the image, which is incredibly dark. And again, that's giving our image more dimensionality. It's adding to the depth of the scene. And with Meraki boulders, having the sun coming in from the right-hand side and just touching a little bit of each boulder, we immediately are attracted to those particular areas. And it helps to contrast with the darker side of the large boulder on the left, giving our subject, again, more depth. And now here we're using the light from the moon mainly. And that's doing a couple of things. Firstly, it's lighting up the water, and combined with the long exposure, it creates this beautiful milky feel in the water. But secondly, since it's lighting up the left-hand side of the rocks, we can actually see them. If the moon wasn't there and there was no light, there would be nothing to separate each rock from any other rock. They would just be a big flat mess. We wouldn't be able to make them out particularly easily. So that little bit of light bathing on the water and on the rocks has changed the entire scene. Now the light on the mountain isn't actually from the moon, it's from the fading sunset, which disappeared about an hour before that. But despite how little light there is from the sun, you can see it's really bringing out the peak of that mountain. It's made a huge difference to the overall feel of the scene because we have an impactful foreground and then our eyes lead beautifully to that mountain at the back. But of course, we're not limited to natural light. We can also use artificial light. And here in Petra, we have this fantastic mood which is created by these candles. And so being able to take advantage of artificial light is equally important as using natural light. And in cityscapes, for example, there are different ways to capture light. We can capture light from the buildings themselves, from cars standing still, or from fast or long-moving light trails. Each of them has an impact on the scene. And again, here we're using striking light trails at the bottom of the image, but at the top we have some light from the building, which is lighting up the clouds at the top. It's adding more depth to our image, just capturing different types of light. But what about dramatic light? We often hear photographers talking about getting a dramatic sunrise or sunset. And as human beings, we can't deny that these particular times of the day have a very strong effect on us. You know, we go to places like Bromo or Angkor Wat, and thousands of people turn up every day just to watch a sunrise. So if we can capture a good sunrise or sunset, then we can almost elicit that same response from our viewers that they might get from a sunrise or sunset in person. But it's not quite as easy as that. Sometimes it takes a few days to capture a beautiful sunrise and sunset. Sometimes we'll get it straight away. For example, in this image from Motakaiki, it took 5 days to get one photo. It was overcast every day, it was raining, and then just for 20 minutes the clouds cleared up on the 5th day and we got this sunset. Now this scene for me is extremely impactful for a number of different reasons, but none of it would be possible without that dramatic sunset. So if you're planning trips in the future, my recommendation is to try and shoot one location over a few days to try and hedge your bets and get the best possible light you can. This image from Glenorchy in New Zealand took 4 mornings, 4 sunrises before we got a beautiful sunrise. So again, having a little bit of persistence can help you get an image you can be extremely proud of in your portfolio for years to come. I've run a challenge on YouTube called Challenge Jimmy, and this is where viewers send me their images and ask me to process them in Photoshop, and hopefully I can give them some advice while I do that. And while most of the images sent to me are beautiful and really well shot, I do get a handful which have roughly the same characteristics. And the email I receive from the sender is usually something like, "Hi Jimmy, here are my images. I tried processing them, but there's something not quite right and I'm not sure what it is." And when I open up the image, I'm almost always greeted with something similar to this. where the photographer has shot a scene with almost no beneficial light. Essentially, we have an overcast sky, we don't have any real foreground, we don't have long stretched shadows or any warmth in the image at all. And when we shoot images like this, there is nothing we can do about it in post-processing. It's always going to be extremely flat. I should point out right now that all of the images in this video are mine. So when I'm being critical of a photo, that's okay because I'm being critical of myself. So those are just 4 aspects of using light. So firstly, we need to draw out some beautiful shadows. Secondly, we have to try and get the light to bathe certain parts of our subject so that we can give it more depth. Thirdly, we can use artificial light to deepen the mood in different ways. So through street lights or through light trails or through building lights, which might illuminate the sky. And fourth, we can do our best to try and capture a beautiful sunrise or sunset. Now, apart from light, what else can we use in our frame? Well, we have in composition something called the rule of thirds. And it isn't a rule, it's really just a tip. And we don't have to follow it with all of our images, but sometimes it does actually make a big difference in our image if we do put interesting subjects in our frame according to the rule of thirds. So let me show you what that means. In this photo, we have one interesting subject. So if we split our photo into 3 parts, we come out with something like this. And the theory goes we should place our interesting subjects at one of the points where those lines meet. So anywhere where these red circles are. For some reason, placing a subject there does seem to make the image more appealing. Of course, that doesn't work all the time. We can place interesting objects in the center of the frame and that works just fine. Or we can place them just off center and that's fine. Or we can put them very far to the right or very far to the left. It really depends on the scene. But I do quite like the rule of thirds when we have one definable subject in our frame. For example, an image that we've already seen here, if you bring up the grid, so the frame here clearly conforms to the rule of thirds with the positioning of the interesting subject. In other words, the rocks in the foreground. But again, this is just a tip. We don't have to follow those rules all the time, and you'll see plenty of examples where I haven't followed the rules in this video. Now, my next tip is capturing an important or impactful foreground. Whenever I'm out in the field with photographers and they ask me if I could give them one tip on composition, it's always look for a good foreground. The foreground helps to tell the story of the image. It's such an important part of a scene because it takes up such a huge amount of the frame that we have to try and capture something interesting. Now I'm going to show you different ways to do that, and we're going to talk more about that later on in the video. But I really want you to start thinking more about foreground than about backgrounds. Because often when we're shooting, especially landscapes, we have these imposing things which we know are going to be our background. So we could just put them in our frame or think about it briefly about the positioning of the background and the interesting subject, but we should be spending more time looking for an interesting foreground because that's more challenging, but also, for me, more impactful. So I've already shown you this image, and in the background we have these imposing structures in the water, these imposing sea stacks, which are beautiful, and we have a nice sunset. But the foreground really finishes the image because obviously we have this water snaking down into the corner, but we have this great little starfish sitting there. And if you look at the image for the first time and you look from top to bottom, it's like a little surprise that you find at the bottom. But if you look from bottom to top, well, you have this great thing in the foreground, which is quite interesting, and then this line which leads you up to the imposing background. This foreground makes the image. If it was just water, it wouldn't be anywhere near as good or moody. Even though it is good to get down low when we're composing, and we're going to talk more about that later, we don't have to do that. For example, in this image in Dubai, I'm obviously on top of a building quite high up. You won't see too many photos of this location with a big foreground like this. Usually people concentrate on that large building in the background, the Burj Khalifa. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I feel like this scene has too much dead space when it's being cropped. You see, there's a lot of sky either side of the Burj Khalifa because it's so tall, so much taller than every other building there. With that in mind, I decided that I would prefer a bigger foreground to take up more of the frame than the subject in the background. Now, this is what a normal composition looks like from this location. And by creating that strong foreground, we not only minimize how much dead space we have, we also add far more interesting elements to the scene. Framing is a fairly standard compositional tip, and essentially all we're doing is creating a frame around the scene in the middle of which we have an interesting background or subject. So here in Mesa Arch, the arch itself is acting as a frame, and we're just peering through it at that beautiful sunrise and the canyons below. And notice how in the foreground we have the sun bathing the rocks. So we're bringing in different compositional elements here. But the frame doesn't always have to be as obvious as this one here. For example, here in the Batu Caves in Malaysia, our main subjects are these birds. Those are the things that we are immediately drawn to and where I want the viewer to look. So everything around them, the rocks, the temple, everything is pushing the viewer's eye straight to those subjects. In this example, the interesting subject, or the most important part of the image, is the sunset and how it affects the mountains to the right. So we have some beautiful colors in the sky, and it's just bathing the side of the mountain. The rest of the image has to complement that particular area. And we need to make sure that the viewer isn't too distracted. We don't want them looking left and right too much. They must be immediately drawn to that sunset. And that's why the scene is incredibly dark. And I did this in post-processing. I created a strong vignette all the way around the image so that we wouldn't distract the viewer with elements left and right. Instead, we want to take their eye straight to the sunset. And so this is an exaggerated version of what I'm talking about. And finally, a cityscape example of framing. This is using the bridge and the water to frame the buildings in the background. So with this example, we can see that we don't have to frame the entire cityscape in order for it to have an impact. We can just frame an element of the cityscape in order for the scene to still look good. Number 8 is a sense of completion. And what I mean by that is when someone views one of your photos, everything makes sense in the frame. It falls together in a logical way so that it's easy viewing. For example, we have a very definitive light trail in the foreground here. And that light trail goes all the way up to the lighthouse. And right above the lighthouse, we have the Milky Way. So there's a full sense of connectedness. It all makes sense when we view the whole process going together. The light trail connects to the lighthouse, and straight out the top of the lighthouse we have the Milky Way, and it just feels right. Now imagine for a moment that the Milky Way was to the right of the lighthouse. So we had the light trail coming along, hitting the lighthouse, and then the Milky Way was to the right. It wouldn't have that same sense of completion. It just wouldn't feel right compared to this scene. And sometimes it's the small things that actually create that sense of completion. Down in the right-hand corner, you can see I've cropped this image right at the area where the corner of the frame meets that part of the road. It's perfectly lined up, and it's small things like that which make a difference. And on top of that, this is a panorama, and it's very easy because there are so many elements of a panorama that we're trying to fit together. It's very easy to cut things off or to not frame the panorama correctly. As in this example here, the road along there to the right snakes all the way along, and we can see the road continue beautifully. So I've made sure that when I've cropped the photo, we've kept in all of that road. Nothing's been cropped too early. Now let's see what happens when we do actually crop an image and we destroy that sense of completion. Well, it may not be immediately obvious where we're getting a sense of completion in this scene. However, when we look at it, we are allowing the mountain to reach its peak and then to go to its lowest point to the right and its lowest point to the left, where you see these arrows. But what happens if we crop it too early? So have a look at that scene and try and absorb it. And here is what happens when we crop it. It just doesn't feel right. We have something cut off too soon, and in our mind, we know there's something wrong. But with the full scene where we've allowed the mountain to go all the way down to its lowest point, it feels much better. We've created that sense of completion. A really important aspect of composition is symmetry. The reason why symmetry is so important is because we take a load of the work out when it comes to mentally processing a scene. If someone can look at a photo and it all makes sense straight away, then we immediately help them to get to the mood of that image rather than having them work harder. And a symmetrical scene is easier for our mind to process than one that's kind of all over the place. Now, unfortunately, Mother Nature isn't always symmetrical for us when we're shooting large landscapes, but we can still create something similar to symmetry. And this is an image we've seen a few times. as in the last example. And what we have here is a very loose symmetry along the top of the mountain. You can see the mountain itself, while it's not symmetrical, it does follow a very similar pattern from left to right. And that symmetry allows us to process the image easier and get to the heart of the scene quicker. And with this Milky Way shot, if we draw a line right down the center of the image, and then we take the left-hand side of the image and flip it over, this is what the scene looks like. That's a perfectly symmetrical scene. But it's incredibly similar to the real scene. And so when we first look at this image, it takes no time to understand what's going on and what we need to be looking at. Now, going a step further with symmetry, I also recommend using reflections anytime possible. This brings us closer to absolute symmetry when we use reflections. In this image, we have a very interesting subject, which is almost perfectly symmetrical. And then we have this fantastic reflection, this smooth water, which is just reflecting back that interesting subject. The beauty of reflections is that when we have something like a beautiful sunset like we have here, and we have an interesting background like these buildings and the bridge, a great way to deepen the mood is to simply reflect back all of those great properties. You know, it's almost like we get two for the price of one, because the alternative is, in this example, just water with no reflection. But by having a reflection here, we basically have twice the impact that we would have without the reflection. We've already spoken about how important a good foreground subject is. So now we're going to take this a step further with get down low. And the reason why I say that is because most of my landscape shots, or at least 50% of them, are about waist height. And I would say another 25% are lower than that, probably all the way down as far as my tripod can go. So about 75% of my landscapes are really low, and the rest are about eye height. Now, when I shoot out in locations, I see a lot of photographers a lot of the time, and the vast majority are shooting at eye height. And I understand that it's more comfortable to shoot at eye height, and some people might prefer to shoot at that level. But most of the time, especially in landscapes, that isn't going to give us the best result. Because as I mentioned earlier, a good foreground can be the most important part of the image. And the closer we can get to those interesting subjects in the foreground, the better. We can exaggerate textures in water, textures on rocks. We can look at patterns and exaggerate those. For example, in Petra, I was at my very lowest point in the tripod, and we can see all the textures in the sand. We can almost feel the lanterns. And the most important thing about this particular composition is that we almost feel like we're in the scene. It creates a really intimate mood. When it comes to landscapes or seascapes, I like to get really close to rocks. And like I said before, we can see the interaction of water around rocks. And look at those textures. I'm pretty much about 6 centimeters away from these rocks. I'm really close in, they're not very big, and it gives us a really intimate feeling like we're virtually there in the scene. And this is from the same beach, and again I'm really down low, almost touching the water as I get into these rocks. And let me show you what it's like when we don't get this low down from the same scene. So that's a shot from the same scene. Now, if we don't concentrate on the sky because this hasn't been processed like the other one, and we just look at the rocks in the foreground, well, the rocks to the right, those are the ones that we just saw in the last image. And you see, we don't have the same personal feeling as we did before. It's kind of distant, and the rocks look kind of disorganized, and there's nothing attractive about the foreground there. Yet, when we go back to that original scene, the whole mood has changed, and having those rocks a little bit bigger and that water more apparent creates a mood which has a much more immediate impact. And here I got more or less as close as I possibly could to these starfish because they're my interesting subject, really. The background is just adding to the mood, but our eyes are immediately pulled to these little guys. And when shooting these fishermen in China, I was down to my lowest point on my tripods. And by doing so, I could capture under their hats and see their facial expressions more clearly. And of equal importance, the bird on the left looks larger and more prominent because we're down low. We almost have a child's perspective here, which makes everything seem bigger and more daunting. Wherever possible, I try to use lines in my photography. Not only does it make it much easier for people to process the scene, it also helps us to guide the viewer's eyes to make them look at something that we want them to look at. Let me show you an example of how important lines are and the different types of lines that we can work with. In this scene, we have something called converging lines, and this is where lines all point to one particular thing. They all essentially come to a head and point to one thing in the distance. And this is what we can also call a leading line, because they're leading the viewer towards a particular subject or a particular area within a frame. In this frame, these converging lines are pushing the viewer to the horizon or to the buildings which are peeking over the bridge. We also have lines to the right and left at the top of the bridge, which aren't straight, but they're still helping to guide the viewer's eye. And I think it's fairly obvious that this scene is very easy to process. It's not difficult to know what's going on here. Again, here we have converging lines, and this time the lines are at the bottom of the screen, and they are pushing our viewer's eyes straight to the subjects who are appropriately dressed and certainly complement the overall mood in the scene. But we also have converging lines pointing out towards the sky too, because we have a strong light source which is again affecting the mood. So we have two areas where we're pointing the viewer's eyes towards. Now, the wonderful thing about cityscapes is that they're full of lines. They're really easy for us to process in general. And a cityscape like this uses vertical lines. And it can be incredibly pleasing to view something that's so simple to take in. And the great thing is we can actually combine lines. So we have again converging lines at the bottom of this jetty, and that's pushing the viewer towards the light source beyond the hills. But we also have vertical lines which are pushing our eyes upwards towards the Milky Way. So we're combining the effects of lines in this particular frame. And each time we're telling the viewer where to look. Here again, we're combining vertical lines and converging lines to help guide our viewer's eye. We can also use diagonal lines which cut across the image. And this is a very subtle example of a diagonal line, a cityscape, but as a more extreme example of a diagonal line is these roads and light trails combined. And of course, we have vertical lines in this cityscape, but we also have a whole host of lines in the roads that make it fairly simple for the viewer to process and quite pleasing on the eye. And we've seen this example a few times, and here we have a line which has actually taken us to the interesting subject, which is the Milky Way. And just as in the last example, we don't always need straight lines. There can be jagged lines, there can be curvy lines. Now we have lots of lines and the textures of the rock where we've gotten low down and we're pulling out some beautiful details, and these lines just guide us nicely up the rock as we enjoy the textures. So lines are a fantastically powerful way to make a scene really simple to process and at the same time tell the viewer exactly where they need to be looking. Now, one thing I particularly enjoy is long exposures. Now, I know it's down to personal taste and it can be a little bit tricky, but not too difficult, as you'll learn in this course. But long exposures using ND filters can completely transform a flat scene into something much more enigmatic. Now, we've already seen the tree from Wanaka a couple of times. Now, this is what the scene looked like with a short exposure. No ND filter, but also we haven't had any processing applied to it, whereas the example photo we have processed, so it's not a fair comparison. Nevertheless, no amount of processing can make this into a very striking image. Now, if you really like a natural photo, then this might be your preference. But I like something which is immediately impactful. And when we look at the long exposure, we can see there's a huge difference. Now, if you're wondering where this warm color cast, this pink color cast comes from, it's from the B&W ND filter I use, the 77mm one. And later on in the tutorial, I'm going to show you how to get rid of that cast if you want, but I often like it in my photos, so I like to keep some of it in there. Another example of how long exposures have changed the scene. Here we have Newcastle upon Tyne in Gateshead, and it's a very nice scene. The reflection looks quite good, but it's not crisp, and we have some okay clouds, but those clouds and that reflection all of a sudden become really impactful as soon as we put on an ND filter for 3 minutes. And finally, from Neist Point, we have a scene which I have processed, but it lacks any real color, no light at all, and just some clouds which haven't been well exposed for. But when we put on an ND filter, this is a Nisi ND filter, for 2 minutes, everything changes. We get this gorgeous smooth water and these white foamy bits that are interacting with the rocks, which immediately give us another interesting element to look at, which we didn't have previously. And of course, we've captured that nice long movement in the clouds. The ND filter completely transformed this into a scene which had no impact and zero mood into one which has a really immediate impact. This next point is about capturing movement, and it's directly related to long exposures because they are using long exposures but without ND filters. Now, there are lots of different ways to capture movement, but I particularly like light trails in cityscapes, especially when we combine them with other compositional elements. Here, I captured this light trail from a bus, and we have this yellow paint going down the bottom, and it's creating a very loose but attractive symmetry. And we have diagonal lines and vertical lines, which all make this scene pleasing on the eye. Now, this scene's a little bit more complex, but I managed to capture movement in different areas. So first of all, we captured the light trails from the boat. Then we captured some light trails in the water. Then I captured some interesting movement in the clouds and also some light trails on the bridge. Now, all of this was done within a couple of frames and then all blended together later. But by doing that, we have a scene which has a lot going on and it's very striking to look at. Now, Vertoramas are like panoramas but vertical. The reason why we don't always call them vertical panoramas is because often when we're shooting a panorama, we'll have our camera in landscape mode and we'll just pan across. But a vertical panorama can also mean when we put our camera in portrait mode, so we're shooting vertically and then we pan across that way. So there's some confusion sometimes when people talk about vertical panorama and they're talking about two different things. So we like to refer to these as vertoramas. And not many people do vertoramas, but actually they can create a really impactful scene and they can make you stand out from other photographers. For example, this must be one of the most photographed places in the world. It's the Antelope Canyon in America. And supposedly the most expensive photograph ever sold was of this exact scene. Now, I didn't want to come out with the same scene as everyone else. And I planned the trip because I know that for a couple of months a year, we actually don't get one ray of light. We get 3 rays of light coming through the canyons at the same spot. So I planned my trip around that. And when I sat down to take the shot, I took this frame here. Then I took another one slightly higher, so we're getting the second light ray. Then I took another one going upwards, and then my final image was directly above my head, capturing this third light ray. And when I combined them all, I created this Vertorama. And I'd never seen anything like this online before, and it got a huge response when I posted it. So try something like a Vertorama. They're stitched together exactly the same as a panorama. It just works vertically, that's all. So there isn't too much difference there. And another commonly photographed location is Gloucester Cathedral. And instead of just shooting along the corridor, this time I shot 3 frames going all the way up and stitched them so that we had this large ceiling with all those details to look at. And the distortion itself is quite surreal, which I think suits this scene. Now the next thing is water textures. When we're shooting seascapes or rivers, often the water is the heart and soul of the mood in the frame. And I've seen many beautiful landscapes or seascapes online which had the potential to be something incredible, but the photographer hasn't taken into account how important it is to capture different water textures. And what I mean by that is different water speeds affect our emotions differently. And I'm going to show you 4 different water textures or 4 different versions of water in motion, and you'll see how differently the mood is affected. For the first scene, it's back to Motakaiki, and here the water's coming right towards us. This was a really quick exposure where we capture it flying in our direction, and you can feel that instant impact as you look at the scene. Next, we have a slightly longer exposure of about 5 seconds, so we're still capturing movement in the water, but it has a smoother texture to it, and it gives us a more relaxed feel. We can still feel part of the scene. It's still a very intimate feeling, but it isn't as striking as the first one. Next, we have a long exposure that we've already seen, and this is a 2-minute exposure. And the reason why this water suits this entire composition is because it's almost glassy. It's so smooth, and because this is quite a cold, empty feeling, giving the water this glassy feel adds to that mood. And finally, this is a 6-minute exposure, and the water was actually quite violent as it was coming up and swirling around. But because the long exposure was so long, it's created a really milky, soft, calm feel. For all 4 scenes that we just saw there, the main element that affected the mood was the water. So when we're shooting seascapes or we're shooting rivers, try to play around with different shutter speeds to see what water texture works best and how that water interacts with the rocks around them. And for you cityscape photographers out there, one of my tips for cityscapes is to look down and shoot down. A lot of photographers like to shoot the big cityscapes where you look across the landscape and you capture all of those beautiful tall buildings. But if you want a different perspective, make sure your camera is strapped to your arm or something else so it's nice and safe, and lean down and take a photograph of the building all the way down, like I did here for a building in Busan in South Korea. Or alternatively, look up. And this applies not just to cityscapes, but also landscapes too. But in this example, I'm going to use some cityscapes. And in two of these examples, my camera is pointed straight up, not at an angle, but directly vertical. And by doing so, we can capture images with a huge amount of personality, like this particular building in Hong Kong, which you probably saw in the last Transformers movie if you're a Transformers fan. And again, this is Busan in South Korea, and it's the same building from where I was shooting looking down. That's the building on the left, and we have an entirely different perspective and feel from this angle. And for one last example, we have a huge building in Shanghai. And by looking up and seeing that cloud movement interact with those two buildings, we create an entirely distant, cold mood. But we also at the same time have these very appealing lines going up the building, and in the bottom right of the building, we've created a sense of completion by cropping right where that line finishes, and we're close enough to this building in the foreground to almost feel those textures. And don't be afraid to use perspective distortion in your favor. Often when we shoot, we're so obsessed with getting really straight lines that we forget that perspective distortion can be used positively. For example, when we're shooting and we have perspective distortion like here, the buildings are pointing outwards, we're creating those vertical lines. But by having those buildings pointing out, we're increasing that sense of height as we look down. Now, if I straighten those buildings up, it would look orderly and fine, but it wouldn't look as unique. And the same goes for this scene too. Now, it'd be very difficult to straighten all these lines up, to be honest, but a lot of photographers probably would have shot straight ahead rather than looking slightly down, and that would have reduced the perspective distortion. But by looking down like this and by using that perspective distortion, all of the buildings have kind of a surreal, unique feel to them as they jut out or point out in different directions. Now for tip number 20, I recommend trying to create a sense of scale in your photography. For example, this is an image I shot a few years ago of Perito Moreno. Now, what we don't really get a sense of in this scene is how large these glaciers really are. They are huge. If a person was standing on the closest glacier at the top, we would just about be able to make them out. But because we have nothing to compare it to, we have no idea of the real scale of it. But let me show you a smaller example of this, where we do have something to measure the scale against. This is a library in Japan, and we already have the books in the library, so that kind of gives us a sense of the scale of the room. But having this gentleman in the bottom left-hand corner really gives us a sense of how tall this room is and how many books there must be to fill all of these shelves. Now, shooting sunspikes can be a little bit challenging, and I'm going to show you how to do that later on in the course, but it can also add an extra little element to your scene, which gives the scene more vibrancy. Often when we're shooting landscapes, if we've got the sun in the frame, the sun automatically gives us more energy as we look at the scene. But we can create even more impact when we can shape that sun into nice spikes. Some lenses are better than others at doing it. I use a 14-24 Nikon lens, which isn't the best. It's not as good as the Canon 16-35, but it can still get some decent results. For example, here at the horseshoe bend, which we saw before, capturing the sunspike isn't really that important for the mood, but it does add an extra element to look at. And a lot of people don't capture the sunspike in their frame when they're shooting the horseshoe bend. Now, I know I might be pointing out the obvious here, and I'm going to use an example that I've used a few times, but try and look for something different. Now, of course, we can already do that with something like a Vertorama or a sunspike, as we've just discussed, but by asking my very generous wife to run up and down with an iPhone, we added an extra dimension to this well-photographed scene that I'd never seen before. That's not to say that it hasn't been done before, but I certainly hadn't seen it before. Most photographs will have this as the foreground, or maybe to the left, and then the Milky Way coming up through the lighthouse as we'd expect. Having that light trail in the foreground just adds something different to look at, and again it gives us that sense of completion as it meets the lighthouse and goes to the Milky Way, and it's much easier for our mind to process when we have this line which is telling us where to look. So try and think outside the box and try and do something different that other people haven't done before. Now, the final tip is complementary colors. And the reason why it's at the end is because often this is something we don't have too much control of, especially not when we're shooting, more so when we are post-processing. And complementary colors essentially states that sometimes colors will work better with other colors. For example, blue and yellow are complementary colors. They work together in a way that makes a scene much more appealing. So if we can reduce the impact of other colors and try and exaggerate two complementary colors at the same time, like green and pink, then we can often come up with a more striking scene. However, as I mentioned, often we have to work with the colors that we're given. In landscapes, if there are certain colors of flowers or certain colors of leaves, then that's simply what we have to work with. Now, in post-processing, sometimes you can alter the colors, but we don't want to do that too much most of the time. So with those tips in mind, I'm now going to show you with two example images that we've seen a few times, how we can combine multiple elements in our composition to come out with the best possible result. So for the first example, we go back to our tree from Wanaka, and you may remember that we conformed to the rule of thirds here and placed the tree at the bottom left intersecting line. We also have an interesting subject in this tree. We've managed to capture an object, this cloud and some other clouds, which are being bathed in light by the sun. We've captured movement throughout the clouds, and by default, we've captured some beautiful, smooth water, which contrasts gorgeously against the tree, which is completely still and calm. And we've created a vignette or a frame where each of the four corners is much darker than the center part of the image, which puts emphasis on the tree, which of course is our important subject. And in the end, we come up with a scene which, in my opinion, has quite a lot of impact. Of course, this frame isn't perfect, but nevertheless, I'm still happy with the final product. And now we're going to finish on a photo from Glenorchy, which we've seen quite a few times and which is composed of a lot of different compositional elements. We have interesting subjects in the mountain, the mist, and the beautiful characterful wooden jetty in the foreground. We have a strong element of symmetry. We have converging and vertical lines. We have a strong light source which is lighting up the textures in the foreground, which not only adds an extra dimension to the frame, it also allows us to create a vignette in the jetty towards the back here, the closest part of the frame, which gives us more depth. We've given the viewer a sense of completion by allowing the mountain to go all the way to its lowest points. We captured a beautiful sunrise through being patient and going back day after day. And finally, the water was smooth enough to include a really nice reflection. And in the end, I came out with an image that I was genuinely happy with, which is very rare for my photos. Usually I'm very critical of any scene that I shoot, but this one I was extremely happy. And that concludes our video on composition. Now I know there's a lot to take in, and even if you try and go out into the field and just try different elements at a time, you'll find that eventually things become second nature. Or if you write them down, they might be good when you're out in the field to just remember the bullet points and go back to them for inspiration. But don't put pressure on yourself to overcomplicate things. Essentially, we need to keep things simple. And the more difficult we make it or the more complicated we make it, the less we'll come up with an impactful scene. There'll be too many elements going on. So try and keep things simple. Don't worry about trying to combine too many elements. Just try and work on one compositional tip at a time until it becomes second nature to look for that.